That sparked a fierce sanctuary city debate across the country. In December, the illegal immigrant accused of murdering Kate Steinle on a San Francisco pier was found not guilty of murder. And now Jose Garcia Zarate is attacking the feds for pursuing new charges against him. Soon after his acquittal, the federal government brought firearms charges against Garcia Zarate. He's now calling for those charges to be dropped, claiming that they're vindictive prosecution. David Leopold is an immigration attorney. He joins us tonight. David, vindictive prosecution, what exactly do you understand his lawyers mean by that?
Well, what I understand his lawyers to be doing is, Mark, what any lawyer would do, and that's represent their client in court. You know, if you were charged with a serious federal felony, I think you'd want your attorney to raise every possible defense, and I think that's what's happening here.
Just with vindictive prosecution, though, as I understand it, usually when these charges are brought, it's because there's a lack of probable cause. No one's arguing in this case that there isn't probable cause, are they?
Well, look, you know, when we talk about vindictive, what I think is vindictive is the way that the Trump administration, the way that others have vilified, criminalized immigrants. They've taken the tragic death of Kate Steinle, and they've turned it into a broad brush attack on immigrants all across this country, when in fact, you know, the stats show, all credible statistics show that immigrants who come to this country out of love for the country commit crimes at a much lower rate. Tucker
has a whole bunch of statistics that show something different on that. But let's just...
Yeah, but I don't know where Tucker gets his statistics, Mark. I know where I get mine.
But the point here is that he's not being prosecuted as an example of an immigrant. He's one immigrant who's been credibly accused of committing a crime for which the federal prosecutors wish to charge him. And you say, okay, now everybody's demonizing immigrants. Well, for start, he's an illegal immigrant, which is different from an immigrant. And the fact that he's one immigrant who's accused of a crime doesn't make him any more typical of illegal immigrants than this mumbo-jumbo we always hear about how they're all high school valedictorians just getting back from their third tour of Iraq.
Mark, then why are we even talking about him? We're talking about him because he's been used by the president. We're talking about him because he killed an American citizen. We're talking about him because he had killed an American citizen. He's accused of a specific crime. Right. All right. So let's talk about reality and let's talk about facts. The credible studies out there, and I'll point you to the American Immigration Council, I'll point you to the Cato Institute on the right, I'll point you to the Center for American Progress. All the credible studies tell us that immigrants in this country are law-abiding, they come to this country, they work hard,
he's not.
They create jobs.
Look, I'm Canadian. It doesn't matter if 99 out of 100 Canadians don't commit crimes. If I do, that's why this point, the fact that, you know, every other illegal immigrant may be law-abiding doesn't alter the fact that he's committed a crime, does it?
Well, you say you're Canadian, and that's fantastic, and it shows that in some ways our immigration system does work. I just wish that our immigration system could work for the rest of the country, for the rest of the undocumented people who, by and large, are law-abiding, create jobs in this country, do phenomenal research in this country. You know, I represent a lot of physicians.
This guy
hang on, can I finish?
Yeah, but this guy hasn't done any of that.
Can I get my point in, Mark?
No, because these are just general talking points. These are general talking points about how
they're facts. They're facts.
No, they're the fluffy bunny unicorn talking points. We're talking about a criminal here, a criminal. So the fact that the guy next door hasn't committed any crimes is irrelevant. I want to ask you about this other story, though, because this is interesting to me too, and should be to you as a lawyer. California isn't just acquitting illegal immigrants of murder; it's also giving them government jobs.
That was a jury, by the way, that acquitted that man. Go ahead.
Lisbeth Mateo, who's an illegal immigrant, has been, and an attorney, I don't know how you pull that off. She's been appointed to the California Student Opportunity and Access Program. She can't vote. She's here illegally, but apparently she has the right to help run the state government of California. I believe she's the first illegal immigrant to be appointed to a statewide office. How's that grab you, David?
I think that's fantastic. Look, she's very accomplished. I think it's fantastic. She's a member of the California Bar. She finished law school. And you know something else? Let me finish. Let me finish. She's a dreamer. And the President of the United States, President Donald Trump, has said time and time again that he loves the dreamers, that he supports the dreamers. Unfortunately, President Trump uses dreamers as hostages to try to eviscerate the immigration law and cut out immigration to at least half of what it should be. It's unfortunate.
Explain this to me. You're licensed to practice in Ohio. So
yes.
You can't practice. If you wanted to practice in California or New York or whatever, you'd have to do this pro hac vice thing where you have to find some local New York lawyer or local California lawyer who speaks for you. So in Ohio...
Actually, with what I do, Mark, I practice all over the country because I'm an immigration lawyer, and we deal in federal immigration law.
Yeah, I understand.
So
I understand federal court. I'm making a point here about state law. Under the cockamamie system you got here, an Ohio lawyer has no presumption of being able to practice in California. How does a Mexican lawyer wind up practicing in California?
She's admitted to the bar. Hang on. You asked the question. I'd love to answer it. She was admitted to the bar. Ms. Mateo took the bar examination. She went to law school. She took the bar examination. She's duly admitted under the laws of the state of California, under the rules of the California Supreme Court. And I think it's fantastic. She represents the best and the brightest of the dreamers. I think we ought to be giving more opportunity to folks. I think we ought to be finding a pathway to citizenship.
So as an officer of the court, you have no problem with a lawyer being here unlawfully?
As an officer of the court, I have no problem with a lawyer practicing in California. Now, the unlawfully part can be solved. If President Trump wanted to solve that problem, he could have solved it. He created this horrible situation with DACA by canceling DACA in September. Those are the facts. Then he said he would save the dreamers. He wanted a deal. Then he held them hostage. I'm just giving the facts, Mark.
No, these are all the generalities, David. By the way, I love this.
General facts.
We need people to come here and do the jobs that Americans won't do. I actually thought one of the jobs that Americans would do was actually being lawyers. But if we're going to get, $8 an hour Mexican lawyers, that will be a boom for the country.
You say something about $8, Mark. You say something about $8 an hour Mexicans and that sort of thing. The other day I watched a segment on Tucker, and you were on, and you did a great job. You were talking about how horrible it was that dog died in the airplane, and you talked about your own dog being sick. And my wife and I lost our dog this year, and it was one of the saddest things we went through. And I hope your dog is doing much better. But what I really wish, Mark, is that you had the same compassion for human beings.
Yeah, no, I'm brutal. Love dogs, hate the human beings. That's what you summed me up there, David.
That's what it sounds like.
That's perfect.
That's what it sounds like, Mark.
You got me back to rights. Nancy Pelosi has a novel new attack on President Trump's proposed wall. It's too high.
Did you see it? How high it is, and the rest of the presidents think the wall? I mean, really? In a civilized society, we'd do something like that? As obnoxious as it is? But a wall that big, separating people? I mean, really?
But we shouldn't be surprised that Nancy Pelosi has strange notions about border security. After all, she thinks illegal immigration can be stopped with a lawnmower.
We all have a responsibility to protect our borders. What do we need to do that? Should there be fencing? Should there be technology? Should they mow the grass so that people can't hide in it?
Yeah, big problem. Mexicans hiding in the long grass. Kurt Schlichter is a columnist for townhall.com, and he joins us tonight. Kurt, is Nancy fully on top of the situation here?
Well, Mark, I don't think Nancy's on top of any situation. And I got to say, after your last guess, I'm a California lawyer, and I got to just say, I'm so very, very proud. I'm proud of the California bar having people, letting people in who shouldn't be here. I would have thought that would have been a basic disqualifier.
Just explain to me how that works, Kurt, because as I understand it, if you ran a feed store, would it be illegal for you to hire someone who's in the country illegally, or if you had an accountancy business. But if you have a law firm, you can make an illegal immigrant your law partner. Is that how it is now in California?
Well, apparently so. In effect, here's the problem, Mark, and it's one that worries the hell out of me. It's an attack. This whole thing about illegal aliens is an attack on the rule of law. The rule of law is so critical. Our representatives passed a law. Remember how a bill becomes a law and you had the little dancing bill on Saturday morning TV and then the president signs it and it's the law. You know, the people get a say. Remember that? And when you don't have that, when you pass a law and then ignore it, you really have no rule of law. And I'm a little sensitive about that. I deployed to Kosovo. I was a lawyer at the time. I spent 16 months away from my firm helping put together that country after the Civil War. I saw what happens when you lose the rule of law. And I don't appreciate being lectured as not being compassionate when I left my family for 16 months to go help a bunch of foreign strangers not be murdered. So just throwing that out there.
You raise an interesting point there, Kurt, because it's selective, this, isn't it? So we're told that apparently federal immigration laws are now entirely irrelevant. But if I decide that I don't like the federal tax laws, apparently that's one of the laws that still applies. So Law 27
that one's still... That one still applies, Mark. Dinesh D'Souza, an opponent of President Obama, he violated a very technical election law, ended up, getting arrested, getting prosecuted, getting a felony conviction, which other people don't, if we're talking about vindictive laws.
You're right. That was a vindictive prosecution.
Look, you can't have two sets of laws, one for the favored folk and one for the normal folk, one for everybody else. That doesn't work. Now, you've been to countries where they had that. Did they seem like nice places, Mark? Were they places you'd want to be?
No,
They're not.
You're right there, Kurt. In fact, that's like kind of a theme this night, equality before the law. The former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe's retirement pension is in the hands of the Attorney General Jeff Sessions, and the clock is counting down on the pension death watch. That's coming up next on Tucker Carlson Tonight. The fate of Andrew McCabe's retirement is in the hands of Attorney General Jeff Sessions. The FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility says McCabe deserves to be fired for letting agents speak to the press about the Hillary Clinton email investigation and then misleading the FBI about it. But that recommendation won't matter on Sunday, when McCabe will be able to retire at the age of 49 with full pension benefits. But if Sessions fires him first, then he could lose that pension. Jonathan Turley is a professor at George Washington University Law School. He joins us now. Jonathan, I can't recall anything quite like this pension death watch that we're on for this guy McCabe. How do you think it's going to go?
Well, I think the odds are against him for one reason only. It's exceedingly rare for the Office of Professional Responsibility to make this type of recommendation. And I think it's probably unprecedented for this particular position, such a high-level individual to be fired just literally days, if not hours, before he retires. So it's something that is rare, and it's going to be difficult for the Attorney General to ignore. Remember, Attorney General Sessions, I thought, correctly recused himself when career officers said, we think you should. Now, career officers are saying, we think you should fire McCabe. I think, consistent with his earlier position, he'll be inclined to carry out to the fullest extent he can the OPR recommendation.
You make a broader point, though, that the FBI has extraordinary powers over us if we lie even carelessly and harmlessly and in something that isn't even a criminal matter to them. but that if we don't do something about McCabe, we're teaching the lesson that federal justice officials can put us in jail for lying to them, as they did to Martha Stewart, but they can lie to us with impunity. So it's a difference between rulers and ruled.
Well, unfortunately, that has been the rule in Washington. It's sort of an animal farm environment where everyone's equal, but some people are more equal than others. Justice Department officials are rarely charged with violations, but it creates, to the disadvantage of McCabe, a glaring disconnect. Michael Flynn was charged with misleading investigators. According to some reports, Comey's investigators found that he wasn't intentionally trying to lie. But he was ultimately charged. Here you have McCabe, who investigators found or believe that he was trying to mislead them, and he's really just looking at a pension change as opposed to prison.
Yeah, and as has been pointed out, Mike Flynn was basically lying over whether he'd discussed something with a Russian diplomat, which isn't even a crime anyway. He's basically being threatened with jail time for misremembering in a conversation with an FBI guy. Isn't what McCabe did, where you've got these weird conspiracy texts, these ones that sound as if they're at least playing over silent coup possibilities, isn't McCabe's damage actually far more serious than anything Flynn did?
Well, I think the distinction is a valid one between what the two men did. In Flynn's case, he was accused of lying about a meeting that was not illegal or even unprecedented. He was meeting with Russians. He admitted he met with Russians. It's just that he said he didn't talk about sanctions. Right. What McCabe is accused of lying or misleading investigators about was a violation. There was something that he did in contravention of federal rules. Yeah. And the difference is one is looking at his pension, one is looking at a prison.
Yeah, we should be beyond pension discussions with regard to Mr. McCabe. Professor Jonathan Turley, thanks very much for joining us. Chris Swecker is a former executive assistant director at the FBI. Chris, everybody seems to think there's some kind of problem, institutional problem, at the Bureau these days. How do you fix that? How do you clean it up? Is it just 3 or 4 bad apples on whatever, I think it's the 7th floor of the building, or is it actually a bigger problem than that?
Well, I'm one of those people that thinks it's a Comey inner circle problem that developed during the course of his very short tenure at the FBI. This would have never happened under Mueller or Louis Freeh or William Webster or even Bill Sessions. So the way to address this is to brush aside politics, brush aside anything that's distracting, and go back to the facts and the precedent, because that's really what these disciplinary actions are all about, and there's ample precedent. I've seen street agents fired for lack of candor, which is really lying, but that's a nice way of saying it. So if it's good for street agents, then it should apply to the executive level as well, assuming that the facts are as they're being reported.
There's texts that have just come out between this fella Peter Strzok, and again, I don't understand. There's 35,000 employees in this bureau, but the same 3 or 4 people seem to have their fingers in everything that mattered. And these texts between Peter Strzok and this fellow Rudy Contreras, they're talking about a FISA court judge, and he's basically playing out Peter Strzok with his lover. Games in which he can improperly influence the FISA court judge. Why are Peter Strzok and his paramour, as we call her, why are they still there?
Yeah, the disciplinary process works behind the scenes. It's not made public. They don't fire you and then decide the facts later. They get the facts, put you on ice, which is basically what they're doing. Peter's on the rubber gun squad right now, as we call it. And then when the facts are determined and they go through the process of recommendation and then action taken, it takes a little while. I mean, it seems bureaucratic, but it's a fair way of doing it. It's not a court of law. It's basically internal affairs doing what they do. So but I can understand that process.
But there's a sense from the public's point of view that there is prima facie evidence of wrongdoing, And bureaucrats are slow walking it, so that if anybody, it's like, you know, Lois Lerner. What penalty Lois Lerner ever pays, it becomes more mysterious and opaque and has less real meaning as the months and years roll by.
I happen to think that the IG's final report here is going to be very impactful, far more impactful than any of these congressional investigations, which basically go nowhere in our political theater. In fact, calling them investigations is being very generous. So these are fact-finding. They can get their hands on data and mobile phones and go straight to the FBI server and pull out all that information. But it is a lot of information to go through.
No, that's certainly true, as you say. I mean, if at the rate those two tweet and text, there could be months and months to go through. Chris, thanks very much. Democrats claim to resist hate, but few can muster the courage to condemn Louis Farrakhan. That story is next.
Like a
Islam leader Louis Farrakhan has hung out with countless Democratic Party big shots, including Barack Obama once upon a time. He's also spent decades spewing hateful rhetoric to anybody who'll listen to him.
Your country has been taken from you by the synagogue of Satan. You come to take our life. Don't be surprised if you lose your own. Farrakhan want to get an army to kill white people, because you see, white people deserve to die.
Yeah, white people deserve to die. Thanks for that useful tip. Victor Davis Hanson is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Congressman Todd Rokita from Indiana has just introduced a resolution in the House to condemn Farrakhan. Congressman, as far as this resolution is concerned, Keith Ellison from Minnesota, for example, who's one of Farrakhan's closest congressional allies, says this whole thing is going nowhere, nobody cares about Farrakhan, and he can get along with cozying up to Farrakhan as much as he wants.
Well, it's complete hypocrisy, Mark. You've pointed it out, Dr. Hanson has pointed it out, this news organization has pointed out, you know, but where's the rest of the media? This liberal media elite that lets all this go by. You know, if this happened to a Republican, you know, if there was some meeting like this, you know, we wouldn't last one day in office, and all the news media would cover it from now until the election and beyond. And it's absolutely ridiculous that this is being covered up, and that's why I introduced, one of the reasons I introduced the resolution.
No, and when you talk, when they talk about David Duke's got 3 followers, one of which is his dog, whereas Farrakhan has huge popularity. With not just with the black community, but also at high levels of the Democrat Party. Victor, what's odd to me is that Farrakhan seemed to go away for a long time. He seemed like something to do with the Million Man March, which is 20 years ago, and he seemed mired in the past. And then suddenly you find out the Women's March, which are the coolest people around at the moment. They protest Trump, they wear the pink hats, and all the leaders of the Women's March are somehow plugged into Farrakhan. He's kind of still current, isn't he?
It is funny because we've known for 3 decades that he espoused racism and anti-Semitism, so the question is, why at 84 does he have this new apocalyptic language? That he didn't just say that express racism, but he said that he used terms like going down and is over. 73 years after the Holocaust, he says the era of the Jew is over. And the answer is that in this transformation from the Democratic Party of old to the new identity politics progressive party, he's useful. He's not an albatross around somebody's neck, but he's a useful asset. And you can really see that. You mentioned the Women's March, Miss Perez and Saussure and Mallory, but gosh, when Danny Davis, think about that, a congressman, says that nobody cares about Farrakhan, and he used the word the Jewish question. That was a 19th century, you know, debate, anti-Semitic debate in Europe about the proper place of the view of the Jews. But in the hands of the Third Reich, the so-called Judenfrage, the Jewish question, was a euphemism of the Holocaust.
That's
so we
right.
have a congressman talking about the Jewish question in 2018. It's absurd, and it just reflects, you mentioned Barack Obama's photo op, but even more interesting, the photographer who took that was bewildered because he said, I don't know why they wanted to suppress it. It was common knowledge that Nation of Islam people worked on the Senate campaign.
Well, you know, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous that I even have to introduce this resolution. It's an easy question. Do you condemn anti-Semitism? And the modern Democratic Party, as the doctor points out, can't answer the question.
Right. I mean, Victor, it seems to be a byproduct of identity politics, that what matters is who you are. So that if a white man says this kind of stuff, he's alt-right, he's part of the problem at Charlottesville, Trump is called on to denounce him. If Farrakhan says this, he can say exactly the same things, and Farrakhan's identity absolves him entirely from it.
It does. It's very scary because in the case of the Women's March, we have a African-American woman, we have a Hispanic woman, we have an Arab-American woman, and they all feel that they get special dispensation to collude with somebody who's an obvious racist and anti-Semite. And the members of the Black Caucus, remember Obama's photo op took place in the Capitol, U.S., in the basement of the U.S. Capitol.
Absolutely.
So people, they feel that they're completely exempt to either collude with or to support or to dismiss this racism, and it's going to create, it just creates this problem of cynicism that nobody really does believe them anymore, because the real question is, what is their agenda? Do they agree with Farrakhan or do they not agree with him? They just need to tell us, and that's why I really applaud the congressman's effort. We need to ask them that question.
No, white people deserve to die. You can't really get any more specific than that. Professor, Congressman, thanks very much for joining us tonight. A German food bank says it simply can't handle the number of migrants coming to its doors and has begun turning them away. That story next on Tucker Carlson Tonight. Food bank says it can no longer handle the sheer number of migrants the German government has dumped on it. The city of Essen has seen its Syrian population grow from 1,300 to more than 10,000 in just 2 years. And local poor residents say that aggressive male migrants routinely cut in line at the food bank and take most of the food, leaving them to go hungry. So one Essen food bank is refusing to sign up additional migrants. For that, they've been denounced as Nazis. Douglas Murray is the author of the excellent book, The Strange Death of Europe, and he joins us. This is the real tension in Europe that you write about between poor Europeans who actually bear the brunt of these migration policies.
Yes. Yes, that's right. It's very good to be with you, Mark. It's an amazing story, this, because this story of this single food bank in Essen, in West Germany, they're saying, look, we've got a lot of poor old people here, we've got a lot of women, we've got a lot of people who queue up and just we want to be helping, and these young migrants push ahead of them, and they just said, we want to help the people we're set up to help here. And for this, as you say, they've been called Nazis. The German Chancellor has come and sat on them and insulted them and instructed them to change their food bank policy. And this is absolutely typical of the pattern we see, not just in Germany, but across all of Europe. You know, Merkel invited in millions of people. The continent, unsurprisingly, is finding it difficult to integrate those people or even house them, and she attacks the people, rather than wondering whether or not she might have made a mistake herself.
Now, you use that fine old British word queue for what polite people do when they stand in line, as they say in the United States. I noticed when I was in Europe during the summer that all these migrants appeared, that I don't know whether it is that standing in line or queuing is a Anglo-American continental phenomenon, but on trains and just at kebab houses and all over the place, you saw routinely, the bus station, you saw routinely aggressive young men pushing women out of the way, or even just at the supermarket. And I don't know whether that's because standing in line isn't part of their cultural tradition, or actually whether it's a portent of something rather more sinister.
Well, you know, you have it there. I mean, a young male migrant pushing ahead of an elderly woman in Germany. What's the natural response of the German state? To call the elderly lady a Nazi.
Right.
You know, say they're the problem. We just had this, by the way, in London, where I'm sitting. Just today, a young man who came illegally to the UK 3 years ago said to the UK officials when they did find him that he had been trained by ISIS. Then was allowed to roam around, and a year later, just last September, he left a bomb on the London Underground, which thankfully failed to completely detonate. So we had 30 people with singed hair instead of 30 school children in body bags. But, you know, everyone's onto the same thing. You know, what was it that failed in the specific counter-extremism policy?
Right.
No. If you keep letting people in, you don't know who they are, the authorities keep on inviting people in at the kind of rate they have in recent years, you haven't got a hope.
Well, in Germany, they have this new party, Alternative für Deutschland, the alternative, which everyone says extreme right-wing. The problem isn't these nice, young, strapping, young Muslim men. The problem is that it's racist Europeans now voting for racist right-wing parties. Where's that going to end up eventually?
You know, I've been thinking about this a lot. My book just came out in translation in Germany this week, and so I've been dealing quite a lot with German press and so on. And, you know, I keep saying the same thing. You've got to be very careful how you tread in Germany. But look, let me put it this way. You've got to find a way for the German people who, for instance, are queuing at a food bank, or who see people who are poor queuing at a food bank, to allow them to raise problems, raise issues that concern them, without calling them Nazis. You've just got to find a way. You've got to find a plausible way for them to vent their feelings about what they see. And currently, there's no way, because every way you turn, you're a Nazi.
There's no way for them to do that. Up next, thank you, Douglas. Up next, we have a special edition of Tucker's Men in America series with Mike Rowe. That's next on Tucker Carlson Tonight.
Long John Silver's lets you...
Tonight we have a Friday edition of our Wednesday series on Men in America. This week Tucker focused on falling job opportunities for young men and how it's ruining the American family. He recently sat down with Mike Rowe to discuss the problem. Here's their conversation.
Mike Rowe, thanks for joining us.
Tucker, thanks for having me.
So you've spent a lot of your adult life watching men work, what they do, how long they do it, why they do it. Tell us what happens when men can't work, when they're out of work, when they're idle and can't provide. What happens to men?
Well, your soul slips out of you somehow or another. You know, it's the frog in the boiling water. Nothing good happens, but the bad things that happen as a direct result unfold in a kind of disaster scenario. You become disengaged, you become emasculated, you start to ask yourself a whole lot of questions you can't possibly answer, and then, if it gets bad, it turns in on itself, and you become resentful, and you look for someone to blame, and ultimately, you square off, sometimes against your own family, sometimes against your coworkers, sometimes against yourself. Long way of saying nothing good.
It's a disaster, as you just pointed out, not just for the unemployed man, but for everyone around him and for the society itself. So given that, and I think that's clearly true, you got 7 million men of working age out of the workforce now, and nobody talks about it. It seems like something approaching a social crisis. Why isn't that in the news more?
I think because we can't decide who to blame, right? I mean, it's not news unless there's a bad guy. So we need a villain. You know, we got to have somebody in a black hat. And we look around, there's no shortage of potential villains, but the hard truth, I'm afraid, in my view, and again, I'm not an expert in any of it, but I think that a lot of what's happened is self-inflicted. You know, I think that men becoming somewhat disconnected from whatever version of manhood they espouse, I think that happens because of relationships with their dad, with their grandfather. You know, grandfathers aren't around anymore. We talk a lot about the role of fathers. Obviously, that's been fractured, but it's extraordinary, really, when you think about the safety net a kid had growing up. There was a dad there, and there was a grandfather there, and there was inertia, and there were a lot of things that the kid could look to, not just for ideas and virtues, but for proof, you know. Right. So that's gone, and that's not just a problem for the individual. It's a problem, I think, if you think a culture has an identity, if you think a society has a soul, these are the enemies of those things.
There's no question about it. Do you think that we value work as an inherent virtue as a society?
No. No, I don't. I think that we have identified work as the proximate cause of our dissatisfaction. And I think you don't have to look far to find endless examples. Look, the best-selling books right now in the self-help section and in general claim to have the solution for how you can work less. Most of the commercials on TV ask a tacit question, you know, how could you be happier? And the answer, of course, is retire a little sooner or work 35 instead of 40 hours. You know, the TV shows that are typically valued tend to embrace notions of shortcuts. You know, in 1,000 different ways, I believe, as a society, we've made the case that the enemy of your happiness is your damn job. And if you can only have less of that, all these other things in some perverse zero-sum game would equal out, and you would smile more. Look, I know it's hackneyed, and I know we've talked about it before, but this is Horatio Alger stuff. This is being suspicious of immediate gratification. It's taking the long view. And most importantly, in my view, you know, we can control how we define a good job. There's a lot of stuff we can't control, but our culture has made it very, very clear that some kinds of work are less desirable than others. And once we set the table that way, then we start to look at some kinds of education as being more important than others. Next thing you know, you got $1.5 trillion in student loans. You've got 6 million jobs available right now that involve training and not a 4-year degree. And you've got a whole generation of kids who are nicely educated for jobs that don't exist anymore with a big fat pile of debt they can't pay back because we lent them a bunch of money we didn't have in the first place. It ain't great.
So I got to say, almost all the happy and successful people I know work and love to work. So maybe there's something, at least for men, there's something about working that makes you happy, just the act of working. Do you think that's true?
I think so. I do think it's true, but I think the lie, like the big underlying bright and shiny lie, is the idea that what you do is the thing that will either make you happy or unhappy. That's not what you just said. What you said is the business of working has an underlying inherent value to it. And I do believe deeply that that's 100% true. If it were true that certain jobs made certain people unhappy or made everybody unhappy, then obviously everybody in that job would be miserable. But, you know, if there's one enduring lesson from dirty jobs, it's the fact that those people as a group were having a better time and were more connected to their work than the vast majority of people I know who make great white-collar livings. It's just an inconvenient truth, if you'll pardon the bromide, but it's out there. And there's a lot of hope in it. You know, if you can find people doing something that you were told is supposed to make you miserable, but they are somehow prospering and happy, you're going to have to square that. The evidence demands a verdict. And
that's
look,
exactly
the good news in all of this is there's a lot of evidence out there that's positive.
The average lumberjack that you interviewed on your show always seemed a lot happier than the average corporate lawyer I know, which is kind of...
There's a sense, it's like being in on some sort of joke. Right. It really and truly is. I mean, we could talk more, but it's basically a band of brothers, and it's the feeling you get when you know that whatever it is you're doing matters. Of course you have to get paid, but you also have to know that you're doing something worthwhile.
Exactly. Micro, that was great. Thank you.
Anytime.
More lumberjacks, fewer lawyers. I'm on board with that. Tucker's Men in America series continues next Wednesday. Don't miss it. Up next, a family has been reunited with its beloved dog after United Airlines accidentally sent it all the way to Japan instead of Kansas City. That's next.